Hello, 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 listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Cult Vault podcast. I am your host, Kacey, and I'm so excited to finally bring to the show Madison McGhee. Hi, Madison.
Hello.
How are you doing today?
I'm good. It's so funny, the time difference. Like, my day is just getting started and you're like, oh, I've been doing things all day. And I'm like, what? It is 9 a.m. for me.
Yeah.
So far, so good. I've literally just made it from my bed to the desk, but
no,
I'm
I
like,
don't like
so
to
good.
leave my bed. The
I know.
morning warmth of your bed is like the most cozy warmth that you can fit. This morning was so hard for me to get out of bed, and my alarm went off and I could hear the kids waking up next door, but it was so cold out of the bed and I was so cozy in the bed. It was really hard. So I feel bad asking you to get out of your warm cozy bed.
This is great. I mean, I feel like I'm at a weird point in my life where I don't have like a real job. And so if I don't have something to get out of bed for, I will be in bed until like 1 in the afternoon. And so it's very nice to have something at like 9 a.m. So I get up at like a normal time. And you did me a favor. You did me a favor.
A little bit of structure, just a
Yeah,
little bit. Too much. You can go back to bed after this.
exactly.
So we are going to be talking about something a little bit different today. It's something that came across, I'm going to say across my desk. I don't have a typical job either as a fellow podcaster. So I'm just going to say things that people in offices would say. This came across my desk, courtesy of Nancy from CrimeCon UK, best weekend of the year. So for anybody that hasn't heard of Madison McGhee and the Ice Cold Case podcast before, would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Sure. My name's Madison, and I have a podcast called Ice Cold Case. I mean, the very top line, I'm investigating my dad's unsolved murder from 2002. The more intricate part of that is I am traditionally a film and television producer, never really an audio person, never really into like the podcast world, and very adjacent to true crime in the sense that I was a listener but not involved in the world really at all. And this also happened to me but came across my desk as well. And I couldn't help but feel so curious sort of naturally because of everyone's really raw curiosity in true crime, but also the fact that my dad was murdered and it was unsolved. And so I jumped into it, and now I'm a podcaster, and that's really weird, and doing this crazy thing. And it's obviously turned into so much else. And yeah, that's a little bit about me. I live in LA and I love it. And I feel like I sound very LA, but I'm not from here originally. So it's kind of funny. I've really taken on a persona of someone who lives in LA. But yeah, that's a little bit about me and my kind of origin story, I guess.
Madison in a nutshell. And that's a pretty complex nutshell to unpack for a number of reasons. Has your thoughts on podcasting and the medium of audio changed since you launched your podcast?
Tremendously. I knew it was different and difficult in unique ways. It is like a totally different, to capture people's attention via audio versus having the visuals is so wild and so vastly different than what I'm used to. And it's almost funny, in film and television, they sort of tell you, don't rely on music to sort of aid a visual, like the visual should speak for itself. And in audio, you don't have any sort of aid. It's like it just has to be, compelling in and of itself. And so it's a unique challenge. And then there's, the gear and the technology, which I am clearly not very good at. And there's all of these things that are just so different than what you're used to when you're doing video. And podcasting's kind of lonely. I mean, you're doing a lot of it by yourself. So you have to figure out how to do things. When I'm on set for TV and film, it's like there's an audio person, there's a camera person. I mean, there's all these people there to do all of the different roles. And here it's like I mean, you get it. You have to just know how to do things and figure it out. And you're kind of by yourself. And so it is really different and difficult, but it's been really fun. Love it now. I've really enjoyed it. I think there's this unique shift happening where audio and visual are meeting now in the middle, where there's like video podcasts and there's video, audio elements, and you can watch the video or you could just listen to the podcast. And so I kind of like that that's shifting because then I get to play with both. So yeah, I like it. I am interested in sort of sticking it out and seeing kind of how the medium shifts and shuffles and merges with other mediums. And yeah, I've been really happy with it so far.
There's a lot to ask you regarding your father's unsolved case. And there's also something that I picked up on when I was listening to you talk to Jamie Rice from Murderish. And I believe that Jamie is also somebody else that appears at CrimeCon, but predominantly the American one. So that's how you two met. I got to hear your little origin story in your interview together, which was really sweet. And just watching you two kind of vibe off of each other was really cute as well. And she was talking to you and you mentioned off the cuff something that I didn't know. You said that you were raised in a borderline religious cult. So you didn't expand much on that. Would you like to kind of indulge me and just tell me a little bit more about that off the cuff comment? Because I was like, hold on a minute.
Yeah. It's very funny now. I mean, it wasn't funny then, obviously, but now it's very funny. I grew up super religious, and on paper, you probably wouldn't think cult, but it was sort of this non-denominational, very evangelical church. I mean, my hometown is super small, probably like 52,000 people total. And there are like 2,000 people that go to this church. So percentage wise, it's big for like my town. I mean, like a percentage of my town is going to this church. And it was the whole idea of evangelical Christianity is like convert. So you're just like going out, trying to get people to come to your church. They build these like community elements so that you want to stay. So there's like basketball on Thursday nights, and there's church on Wednesday, and there's church on Sunday morning and Sunday night, and then there's youth group on Tuesday, and there's Bible study on Monday, and then all of a sudden you don't even realize it. Every day you're with these people doing something related to this church. I think one of my favorite examples is growing up, and again, at the time, I'm not even thinking cult. I skipped school one day. They like told us not to go to school, and we stood outside on like the side of the road holding anti-abortion signs. I'm like 11. I'm not old enough to even understand. I couldn't even have sex. And I'm like, what am I doing? Like at the time, I'm like, yeah, like pro-life, whatever. Looking back, I'm like, I didn't even know like what I was doing. And my mom kept me from school to go do this thing. There was like, I can't even remember what it's called now, like the Right to Life rally. It was like a rally that they called it. And we would like go to the courthouse. We would miss school. It was crazy. And that's one of those moments where I look back going like, oh yeah, cult, like so insane. And just so blindly loyal to like this group, and like feeling like if I left, I would have no friends. I mean, I couldn't really leave. I was so young and like had no real control over anything. But yeah, like, I mean, there were people who obviously didn't follow the rules and sort of got away with whatever, being really sneaky. But I was so in it. Like, I would not break the rules. I was so dedicated to it. I mean, we were going and like setting up chairs and vacuuming the room. And like, I mean, it was so, when you watch these documentaries, it's like, okay, yeah, these people are in India or Australia or wherever, but we were doing the same thing. It just looked a little different, and it felt like we had a bit more freedom. So you weren't as like, oh, I'm in a cult, but like we were totally in a cult. Even leaving, I mean, I don't speak to anyone at all that I knew in like that time of my life, because they all are like, if you're not in it, you're not like, you're out. And so yeah, very weird. And then, that develops this very weird dependency on community. So then I graduated high school, I moved away, so I got out of it. And then I joined a sorority, which is like another form of a cult. And then I left that, and then I worked at a coffee shop where like it was sort of the same vibe. And like everyone that worked at this coffee shop was like friends with each other and we didn't have any other friends outside of it. And it was very like, I just jumped from like one thing to the next. And so now the word community is like very weird to me. And I hate when people are like, we're just building community. I'm like, no,
Yeah.
I'm out. I'm out.
Hadn't thought about that with the word community. It's usually the word family I associate. You know, when somebody says we're just a big family, I'm like, I don't know.
Yep.
That makes me like, that's a red flag to me. So many different groups had the nickname the family, and 9 times out of 10 were, you know, extremely abusive and violating multiple human rights. Just interesting to hear you talk about different communities that you've been a part of that have shared elements of what I've been talking a lot about on the show to do with coercive and controlling behavior, but very different contexts. You know, you've got a religious group, you've got a sorority, you know, so kind of educationally associated, or academically associated. And then you've got a workplace environment. And I've been sort of on my soapbox a lot lately, just trying to really explain how all of these different contexts are linked through you know, these similar identifiable traits. And when I was listening to Ice Cold Case, I've felt as though some of those traits were seeping into sort of the police department's reaction to you, kind of wanting to reopen your father's case and asking what happened at the initial crime scene. And I don't know if you got those same kind of vibes, and maybe we can talk about that a bit later on. But that's kind of like the feeling that I was getting around the community surrounding the police department.
Yeah. It's really interesting. And I think it's common in the States, and I'm learning a little bit about the UK just from people I know and connections I have now, like Stephen Keogh, who was sort of part of a police department in the UK. It does feel different, but in the States, it's, you know, whatever you see in a movie is like pretty accurate. I mean, it feels like this sense of like family brotherhood is like a word that they use. And so it's hard to know as I'm looking into this if there was any foul play on behalf of the police or any sort of just negligence, like even if they didn't have anything to do with it, but possibly it's unsolved because someone didn't do the thing that they were supposed to do at the time. It does feel like this sense of, well, we're going to protect our own. We're going to make sure that our brother doesn't get implicated in this. And that is scary because it's like, well, how do I know that that you're looking out for my best interest as a community member and not just looking out for the best interest of like your little group of people? And so it's hard. And I struggle obviously with like a little bit of trying to sense it out just from growing up. Like we would have protected anyone part of our group before we protected anyone else. And that happens obviously with like pastors who do weird things or cheat on their wives or whatever. And it's like everyone runs to their defense. And so it feels a little bit like, is that what's happening here? Is that possible to happen here? Because they're just going to keep protecting themselves and not let anything go. And I could feel that when I went to ask questions the first time. It almost felt like this sense of like, okay, we just need to be careful what we say because we don't want to out anyone for doing anything wrong, whether it was intentional or not. And it did feel like everyone was kind of being very careful with their words so that they wouldn't do that. And so, yeah, it feels weird to have this sense of like, you take this job presumably because you want to protect your community. I mean, their whole slogan is protect and serve. And it's like, who are you protecting and serving at the end of the day?
So it's possible that there's some corruption. It's possible that there's some exploitation of positions of power that certain people hold, especially, you know, people in positions of authority, whether that's financial authority or whether that's like legal authority. And I think it's exactly as you said, that's scary because then you don't really know who you can trust and who's being honest. And if something was to happen to you, if the right action would be taken to protect you. And that's without even considering how many unsolved homicides, did you 250,000 plus unsolved homicides in America you mentioned in your podcast?
Yeah, there's so many.
So if it is corruption or the exploitation of a position of power, that implicates almost anything that the police department, at least in your area where you grew up, has ever done. And then how far does that go? So, I mean, that's like giving me a bit of, I say this a lot, bit of existential dread, because then, you don't know where it ends and how far it goes.
Yeah.
But the way that you discovered your father's murder, it's not really sort of, was murdered and then you were told about it. It's a bit of more of a complicated story. So I wondered if you could just let the listeners know sort of how you found out, what your reaction was, and then how you decided you were going to investigate it independently because nobody else wanted to.
Yeah. So when I was 6, my dad was murdered, and it is a young age, and there's totally room to wonder what you tell a 6-year-old. So I don't fault my family sort of for that questioning of, what do you say and what do you do? But they told me that my dad died from a heart attack. And I mean, I wonder still how long that would have gone on for. When I was 16, almost 17, I was like a few months away from turning 17. I had a very weird feeling. At the time, I would have said God told me, obviously, that this thing happened to me, which is a very funny part of the story. No, I don't really talk about it in the show, but like, yes, I was still in this like religious organization. So I was very much like, oh, it was God. Now I'm like, I have no idea. I just had this weird feeling. But I saw my cousin who is sort of involved in the day, and he doesn't like that phrasing, but that's just the reality. That's not an implication in the case or anything. He was involved. He was there that day. I mean, he was just there. There's no getting around it. So my cousin, I saw him, and I had this very strange feeling that he was there when my dad died. So that's not wrong. I was right, which is crazy because I didn't know anything. But I didn't know that my dad was murdered. But I was like, I think Omar was there when my dad died. And that turned into me asking my mom about it, because I was pretty open with my mom about, like, I would have these weird feelings sometimes about random things, and I would tell her about them, and this was one of them, and I don't think she was expecting this to be one of them. And they were little things like, I don't think I should go get my eyebrows waxed, and then the lady would like burn my eyebrow or something. And it's like, I knew that this was going to happen, like very weird things. So I don't think my mom was ever expecting me to be like having some weird thought about my dad, And so we get in the car and I ask her about Omar and why I had this weird feeling that he was there and something weird was going on. And I felt like people were telling me something. And that's when my mom told me that my dad was actually murdered, and it's an unsolved case. And Omar was sort of involved in the day as part of this greater story of a home invasion, and et cetera, et cetera. And so that's when I found out. And my mom's I just was with her a couple weeks ago, and I forget when I'm not with her in person how sort of crass she can be. She's very blunt. She's just like, she just says things and that's it. And so sometimes I forget the tone in which she told me that my dad was murdered. And when I'm with her, I'm like, oh, I remember now. Like, you were just like, it was like, this is it. This is what happened. And so it's kind of ironic that she didn't tell me, because she sort of has that personality and she's like that. But she didn't tell me, and that's how she told me. It was really interesting because I don't know if even like I remember my initial reaction at the time. I definitely wasn't like, I'm going to look into it. I took a little bit longer, and I think the retelling of this story in the grander history of time will probably translate to, I heard this when I was 16 and I thought, I just have to do something about this. That is not really what happened. I was like, oh, that's crazy. Anyways, I'm going to live my life a little bit. And then I kind of sat on it for a while, and I came back to it. I'm sure it messed me up in ways that like I don't really realize, but it wasn't like something that I was like, oh, in this moment, I've decided that I must investigate my dad's murder. So it took a while to get to that point. And yeah, it was pretty jarring. We were in a Buffalo Wild Wings. I don't know if you have those in the UK, but it's like a wing spot. I mean, it's like not I don't even eat meat anymore. And I always joke, like, that's why I stopped eating meat that day. But yeah, it's very weird.
Do you remember of your father? Do you have like core memories of him before he lost his life when you were 6 years old?
So, I have a few big ones, not a lot. It's very strange. I get weird feelings. Like I remember him, but I don't remember like moments. But I have a few like big ones. I remember like him trying to teach me how to dribble a basketball. I remember picking up my sister from school. The Nelly album had just come out and he would play that in the car. So I remember that. And I know like every word to all of those songs. Hey. Yep, that one. So funny. I'm hot in here. I know all of those songs. So it's really funny to have like weird things like that. I remember, and I actually have been talked to this person, and this is like an unlocked memory. He had a friend who had a daughter, and she and I were really good friends for like the short time that I knew her. And I don't know where they are now, but I just remembered that. And they would come over all the time and we would like have like play dates or whatever. And yeah, I mean, I remember things like that, but I don't remember a whole lot. And you almost kind of think like if a kid loses a parent super young like I did, it's almost better because you don't have like the hole. Like there's not anything really missing. You're able to sort of build this new normal quicker than if, I was like 9, 10, 11, 12, and then you really can tell like, oh, these formative years I'm missing. And then even as an adult, it's like, oh, well, I've built these formative years and now I've lost a parent where like it's a little bit different. I talk to my mom like every other day. I don't talk to my mom every day. So it's like different than losing them when you're like having these formative everyday kind of years. So in a way, I feel grateful that I don't remember a lot because I think it would be more difficult. But then you always have that like, but I could have had all these things and I don't. And so it's all bad in a different way. And so, yeah, it's just kind of an interesting journey to go on, losing a parent at any age, but I'm sort of having to grapple with losing my dad at 6. So I was almost.
Yeah. And through murder as well, which
yeah,
I'm sure adds another extremely complicated layer on top of, just kind of coming to terms with losing a parent at any age, as you said before. You mentioned in Ice Cold Case that you have a number of siblings, half siblings. And so have you spoken to them, the older siblings, have they been able to kind of like tell you a bit more about who your father was to them?
Yeah, none of my older siblings had like a great relationship with my dad. So that is interesting. I also don't speak to them a ton. So I've only met my sister in person ever. And I knew her when I was like young. So we've got like photos together and like we were together all the time. And so I know her obviously. And the rest I've never met. I've never met another sibling in person. I've talked to a couple on the phone and like messaged with them, and that's kind of it. And none of them, like my youngest brother, obviously he was 7 months old when my dad died, so he doesn't really remember. That's a lie. He was like 9 months old. He was like 9 or 10 months old. He was less than a year old. So he remembers, obviously, nothing. My older brother was in prison when my dad was killed. So it's like he doesn't really have a great relationship with my dad. So it's like everyone's kind of all over the map. And my sister obviously was with him the most. And she remembers a lot and she tells me stories. But even then, like, it's funny. I mean, I remember this. She was 16 at the time. So they had a very like teenage daughter-dad relationship. And I think she sort of lives with this regret is maybe the closest word to use of like, I didn't appreciate him enough and we were arguing, but that's like so typical for that age. It's like that's just your relationship with your dad, especially when my dad was super strict. So, you resent his rules and you don't want to, play the game that he wants you to play and all those things. So I think they had a really interesting relationship towards the end, but she has a lot of memories with him that she's able to share. And that's really nice. I can't help but think, I would have been the younger one. So I would have gotten away with everything. So I'm bummed about that. But yeah, it's very interesting. We all had sort of a unique relationship with my dad, and that is special because it's all our own. But we all see him very differently.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting kind of aspect of the Ice Cold Case podcast is your father being this almost chameleon, or this kind of, man of many faces. He is a different person to every person that you introduce in the show. And I think that that's really interesting because it's very realistic, I think, to human beings. We are one type of, I'm Kacey when I interview and host a podcast. I'm a different Kacey when I'm with my kids. I'm a different Kacey when I'm with my partner, and so on and so forth. And I think sometimes when we listen to true crime podcasts, there is, especially what I would say the more sensationalized and perhaps even sometimes unethical forms of true crime podcasts are almost locking in on one particular personality trait that a person had and using that as almost the whole definition of a person. So what I really appreciate about your podcast is that you are very honest about your father and the person that he was. And despite all of those things, it's still important that he has coverage and a spotlight on his case, and he has some, efforts go towards trying to solve his murder. So I didn't know if you wanted to just talk the listeners through what I mean by all of this stuff.
Yeah. There's this sort of idea. I mean, true crime is a weird genre and world that's been created and sort of in the last 20 years has taken on a whole new life. I mean, I think we were always fascinated. The news has been the news since before time. I mean, the reason we have hieroglyphics and all these things is because we were telling stories to each other about the crazy, messed up things that were happening in the world, right? So we've always been fascinated by death and murder and all of these things for forever. But really, as media has taken on a new life, it's become a whole new beast. And I think something that has transitioned is this idea that it's really only sad when the person didn't deserve it. And we decide who deserves and doesn't deserve to die based on our own bias, who we think reminds us of us and we don't think we deserve to die, and all of these things. And so true crime has become a very whitewashed genre just solely based on the fact that we see ourselves in these victims. And it's very easy to say this podcaster who lives in LA, who has awesome friends and looks like me, didn't deserve to die because I see myself in that person. And then you have my dad, who is a very specific person who was a drug dealer and became an informant and has kids with multiple women and, isn't necessarily this person that everyone sees themselves as. He's not the all-American family guy. And so when you open up that story, I have the burden of trying to get you to care about him before we even jump in, because you don't just inherently hear about this person and then, and they were murdered and go, that's so sad. And so it's been difficult, to podcasters who maybe aren't as ethical in their storytelling. If they were to take on my dad's case, the way that my dad would be portrayed is completely different than the way that I'm talking about my dad. And that's intentional because I want you to see him as a person so that you jump into this story the same way that you would if a white woman went missing in a really wealthy neighborhood in LA. And so it's a big burden to carry because my dad is not someone on paper that would get a lot of attention and he didn't, and get a lot of care and consideration in reporting. And so that was a big goal of mine to do and to try to portray him in a way that really got people to see all of the different sides of him and see how he was different things to different people. But also think about the fact that I always use this as an example, even the most beautiful, popular girl in your high school was someone's enemy. Someone didn't like them. They ghosted a guy and hurt his feelings. They pushed a girl down the stairs and hurt her feelings. They were a bully at some point. Everyone has sort of a villain side of them. And we don't hear about that when someone dies and they're beautiful and they're a beauty queen and they have a wonderful family and they were going to college and had so much potential. You just don't hear about that stuff. And rightfully so. We shouldn't be talking about that. But when you see my dad, that's the first thing that people want to talk about when they talk about his murder. And so trying to kind of break that up a little bit and show that in this genre, as we're so fascinated by all of these stories, there are people who aren't getting the same attention, and our fascination is like helping these cases. So how do we, use this curiosity that we have for other people to help people that aren't necessarily getting that? And so that's kind of the whole point of this.
Yeah, it's such a strange space. And I think the way that you approach it with your humor and your marketing, I wanted to let the listeners know that Snitch Ass Daddy, or Sad for sure, is actually a song that you have produced, which I was listening to on Spotify earlier. I'll put a link in the episode description. It's like, you're combining humor with your activism, and it's having a positive effect on getting results in finding out what happened to your father. So I think when there's so many, there's extremism in everything. And when you think about the true crime space specifically, there's like this weird extremism when it comes to kind of romanticizing or obsessing over bad people. Like Scott Peterson, for example. I think there's this weird thing where so many women write into him and say that, he's the love of their life. It's weird. It's like there's extremism on all levels, but when it comes to sort of like an average person's story, I mean, and I don't mean average in the sense that he was an average guy, because to you, he's your father, which means that he'll never be average, just a typical person in society to the rest of us. It doesn't get treated that way, and it's very strange. And I think you're so right in all of the things that you've said about how we approach the subject of true crime. And I'm not necessarily saying I do it right. I'm not saying that here's the perfect recipe. It is something that I discuss a lot, because I think it's important to keep having the conversation with people and seeing how we can move forward. But what I really admire about your marketing strategy and the way that you kind of put comedy into your work that is, unfunny when we're talking about murder, specifically your dad's murder. You said in another podcast episode, I'm the only one that can do that because this is my story. And I absolutely was like, yes, own that, especially as somebody that grew up in a cult, because there was probably not a lot of times where you could do that for yourself.
Yeah, it's and it's like healing in a way. And I think it's helpful for other people too. It opens the conversation in a less serious way. I feel like one of the funniest things that happens to me on like a daily basis is, I'm in an elevator, I'm with friends, and I meet someone for the first time, and I'm like, oh, they're like, what do you do? I'm like, oh, I have a podcast. And I'm like, oh, interesting. And then they're like, oh, what is it? I'm like, true crime. And, they're automatically assuming I just talk about a different case every week and I have nothing to do with it. And so they're like, oh my God, like I love true crime. Like, what's your podcast? And then I'm like, oh, I'm investigating my dad's murder. And their face just like drops because they've brought it up in a way that they're like, oh my God, podcast? You have a podcast? Like, I love true crime, whatever. And it's so funny because then it's like they grasp like the depth and the seriousness of it. And I think for them, I'm watching this moment happen where they're like realizing like, oh, this thing that I'm consuming for entertainment is real. And I have like a funny personality. So I'm like, oh my God, like, yeah, like totally. It's fine. And it helps sort of just like bring in the conversation. I think if I were super serious about it, it would deter people, because it's like, then you're building these walls and you're not letting people sort of join you on this journey. And I always say, like, that's the reality of it. Some days it's funny and some days it's not. And some days it's hard. And some days I'm sad and some days I'm happy. And some days I'm able to have conversations with people about it. And some days I'm not. And that's just the reality. I had a conversation with a network that really was interested in the podcast. And it was right around the time that the song was about to come out. and they were very weary of the song. They were like, I don't know, like if you should, I don't like the song, like I don't know. And I was like, if you want me to only be the sad, grieving daughter, I'm not that. That's just not, I'm not going to go on TV and cry every time because that's just not the reality. Some days it's really sad. And some days I'm just like pushing through with humor. And that's just the reality of grieving and life. And still just anyone does that with anything, let alone like something super dark and serious. But we all do that. And I wanted to be as real as possible. And my show has a more serious tone. And I knew that that wasn't my personality. So it was like, how can I show people sort of both sides of me?
Right.
And this song was one of them.
I really enjoy that, especially because your marketing headshots are super serious as well. So you're like, in a business suit, and I'm like, oh my goodness, who's Madison? And then you watch you and a couple of other interviews, and you're like, oh, she's just a goofball. She just likes having a laugh and just connecting with people. Your interviews and your podcasts and everything all comes with calls to action. You've got that approachability where if somebody had some information, they might be reluctant to come forward if you seem like somebody that isn't approachable. So again, you've got that kind of realistic element of humanity, same as the way that you talk about your father. I think there's definitely a way that drug dealers are portrayed and stereotypically portrayed in TV, in media. So I didn't know your father, so I don't know if he falls into any of those stereotypes. It doesn't sound like he does, especially after, he sustained an injury and couldn't work anymore. And what we're seeing now with the big pharma movement and the fallout of, is really unsuspecting individuals being drug takers and drug dealers in certain parts of America. You're seeing mums who are involved with all community aspects and they've had an injury or an accident. And the only way that they can function is by taking this drug, which is being given to them by their doctor. And I know that that's a very different example to what we're talking about here, but it's not as cut and dry as somebody rolls up in a car with tinted windows and they do that weird, like, drugs, money, handshake exchange.
100%.
I just wanted to make that point.
No, I love it. And I'm from West Virginia, where we were the most severely impacted by Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family's big sort of, I call it a conspiracy to get everyone hooked on their drug. Chris Rock had a very, very, very good SNL monologue right after Luigi Mangione gunned down a CEO, the healthcare CEO in New York. And it's something that I have been thinking about. We don't flinch when this happens to Black people in the streets who are dealing drugs. And this happened to a white man in the streets in New York City. And everyone just stopped in their tracks. And they put so many resources behind finding the guy who did it. And I literally couldn't stop thinking about the fact that they did all of that for this guy who essentially is a glorified drug dealer, right? A just billionaire drug dealer. And no one has solved my dad's murder yet. And on paper, my dad is the exact same as this United Healthcare CEO, minus the billions of dollars that he had. And we look at people very differently based on how they look and their socioeconomic status. And, healthcare and pharmaceuticals are a huge separate topic.
Yeah.
But it's true. You bring up, it's an excellent point. People who are doing drugs now in America look very different. And when white people started dying from opioid overdoses, that's when it became an epidemic. People were dying from that long before. A lot of Black people were dying from it long before. But until a lot of middle class, high class Americans, white, whatever Trump thinks Americans are now, because now we have no idea, whatever his idea of American is, started dying from this, then it became an epidemic and it must be stopped. And we're losing all of these rich white people to this drug and it's an epidemic and it's so sad. But this was happening long before. And I think that's sort of the idea here too, which is people have been dying for a long time. Obviously, podcasting's new and all of this stuff is new. But it's really a shame that the first thing we do when we get a microphone is like, we have to find this missing white woman. And that's the idea. It's not, we need to like find justice for humanity. It's like, oh, these white people have not had justice because their case hasn't been solved. It's a really interesting scenario because, like, yes, of course, everyone's cases deserve to be solved. But I think when we lose track of the intention behind it and it becomes more about like, well, what case is going to get my podcast to blow up? Is it this Black guy, or is it this young, beautiful woman who is from this small town and was a teacher? If that case is going to get me more downloads, I'm going to cover that case. And that's where we're losing the mark here. But yeah, it's a very interesting conversation, and I'm glad people are having it. I'm glad that I get to be a part of it. I hope that, what I'm doing is helpful. I think that it's fun in a way, in a sick, weird way, to be able to use the skills that I had from film and television and storytelling to be able to tell my dad's story and to be able to do it in a way that feels like it gives him the justice that he deserved and the story that he should be portrayed about him. And I hope that other people are able to do the same.
It's a difficult space to work in. I think, first of all, I think Trump's idea of an American is actually to be South African at this point is what I'm convinced of. But I think the listeners know at this point, I try not to be too explicit where my political leanings lie. I remember when Madeleine McCann went missing, and obviously that was national and international story, and still very much is over here. And there was this question a few years later about the idea of, hegemony, like one state or social group has leadership or dominance over another. And there was a lot of talk around how journalism uses hegemony to further political agendas, socioeconomic agendas. And at the time that Madeleine McCann went missing, there was a very small article, like page 4 or 5 in one of the main broadsheets about how we were going back into Iraq or Afghanistan. And on a day where there wasn't another story that could be put on the front page of this little tiny girl with blonde hair, there was this idea of whether it was a scapegoat for other things that were happening in the world that also needed to have our attention. And I don't know how much that's played into the whitewashing that you talked about in terms of, JonBenet Ramsey's case and Madeleine McCann's case. And I do remember reading a newspaper article about a woman whose teenage girl had gone missing in that same week, and no newspaper picked up on it. She had run away a couple of times previously, but the mother was trying to say that this isn't the same as the other times that she's gone missing. I don't remember, I was very young when this happened, and I don't remember the outcome of the mum and the teenage daughter. But I think it's just another example of how, media and, media before podcasts has done the same thing, or kind of built the foundations for true crime podcasts to then continue picking and choosing cases like Madeleine McCann. And all of the cases that I'm sure, like most true crime podcasts, if you look at the list of episodes that are available to listen to, have covered the same cases, have covered the same serial killers, most infamous serial killers, and then the most infamous true crime cases, whether they are solved or unsolved. So typically you're going to have Ted Bundy and you're going to have JonBenet Ramsey in all of those catalogues. I'm not saying that it shouldn't happen, but also there should be all of the cases, including your father's case as well.
Yeah. I had this conversation with another true crime podcaster, and it was a really interesting conversation, and it was a pretty disheartening conversation. I brought up the fact that, in the industry and in TV and film specifically, but also in podcasting, we use popularity as a measure for success and what an audience wants, right? We say, okay, if there's an episode about JonBenet Ramsey and it gets a lot of downloads, that must be what people want to hear about. My argument was, we almost decide what people like because they only can listen to what we give them. So if you're only going to make, if 85% of your episodes are about white cases, and then you go to a pitch meeting and say, well, our audience just really loves cases about primarily white people. Well, that's all you've given them. So you have no real measurement because that's mostly what you've given them. And so we actually decide what people like based on what we give them. And if we start to tell more diverse stories from more diverse perspectives, I think you'll start to see that those are more popular because those resonate more with people because it just feels better to listen to. It's more ethical. It feels like, oh, I'm hearing this from a family member. I feel better consuming this in the same way that I'm in an elevator with someone and they find out I have a true crime podcast and they find out it's about my dad. And they have that moment of shock because I can see them realize I'm consuming things that are about real people. And this podcaster was basically like, oh, no. I don't think that's true. I don't think that we are deciding what people like. I think they just like these things. And, I think you can't argue with data. And if we just gave people more diverse stories, I think the data would speak for itself and people would really actually relate and resonate with those stories more.
Absolutely. I agree. As somebody that, interviews people that are survivors of cults, so, the people that have had these experiences. So I'm coming from a very different perspective of talking about people that I have never. But your father, he was a black man. Do you think that this has impacted the way that your father's case was handled from the get-go by police since?
Yeah, I do. I do think that it impacted the way that it was investigated and the way that it's treated now. I think whether that was maliciously done, intentionally done, I don't know. I can't say. I think that's where it's a little bit more of a gray area. But I just think that the internal bias inherently created boundaries that people did not cross in the name of solving my dad's case and that they would have crossed for someone else. And I think now recognizing that is holding people back from investigating further to sort of bring this conversation back to the beginning in a way that that way they're not implicating themselves. If they find out that there was bias, if they find out that there was sort of racial motivation behind not investigating, and to solve it now, then they're sort of outing themselves. And so I think it's holding them back from really diving into this. And I'm at a point where I'm like, I don't really care. If that's true, fine. But I still want to solve this case. So I can get over that if you sort of step up now. You can course correct this. You can make it right by just solving this case and doing your job so that I don't have to be doing all of this. So I think it's a sort of vicious cycle. Once you get in it, it's very hard to get out because then you have to almost admit that fault. And people are very, very cautious of doing that.
The area that you lived in, the area that your father was murdered in, what was the socioeconomic status like at that time? And were the communities that were Black communities, were they sort of isolated because of kind of people say that the desegregation happened, but in some places it didn't happen, It might have happened on paper, but it didn't happen in communities and it didn't happen in towns and cities. So what was the feel like in the communities that you had growing up in?
It was pretty white. There's a very small percentage of Black people in this area. And it's, they weren't necessarily segregated off, but it's a low socioeconomic town in general for everyone. And it's really interesting because it used to be more booming, which is very common. It's Appalachia. So this is an area where coal mining was big, industry work was big, factory work was huge, and that was starting to die off around this time. So coal mines were closing, factories were getting replaced by machinery, things were getting shipped to other countries for cheaper labor. And so this area, which was at one point, very well off and doing really well, and people would describe as like a bustling town, was not the case anymore. And it obviously impacts different races at different levels. But I think overall, there was a lot of poverty. There were a lot of people living in like lower income households just due to the fact that like these industries that were once carrying families from generation to generation were slowly going away. And then you were sort of left with whatever remained. And that was also part of the reason why in the Black communities, they have to turn to drug dealing because you have to feed your family. And so it's a very interesting sort of cycle. And this is also post, the war on drugs, where there's conspiracy theories, which I don't know if they're conspiracy theories that the government was like peddling a lot of crack cocaine into these communities for Black people to sell so that then they could get arrested. So there's just a lot of like different weird stuff going on. And this was a really big area for that. Yeah, pretty low socioeconomic. It was integrated for what was there, but there was very little Black people. So, they were getting treated differently.
Right.
By everyone else.
The police force would likely have a very small percentage of Black police officers.
None at all that I'm aware of.
Right.
Yeah. None at all. Yeah. I think they would have said by now if there were. I've said multiple times that there weren't any, and no one has been like, no, actually there was one guy. And like you look at a photo of like all their sheriffs and it's just like white people.
It's just strange to think about now because I feel like, I'm saying this as a white person, so I'm probably just being very ignorant and not realizing like how deeply entrenched and systemic these issues still are in terms of racism today. But I feel like if those same photos were taken today, you would expect there to be, at least a small percentage of Black police officers. But then again, who knows? As you said before, America's in a very strange state of flux right now, and who knows where the dice will fall. You mentioned before that your dad was very strict with your older sister, who was 16 at the time that he died. Was this because he was a churchgoer himself? Was he involved with the church, or was that just something that you did with your mom?
It was on my mom's side. I think my dad was really strict because of his background. He was really adamant that he didn't want us to sort of fall into the lifestyle that he was a part of. And so I think he was really strict with my sister, sort of had the adverse effect, but he really didn't want her to sort of go down a darker path. And so he kept her home on the weekends, didn't want her to go out and party with her friends and, get addicted to anything and sort of live this lifestyle that he felt sort of like handcuffed to, for lack of a better word. He was very... He felt like he was a victim of circumstance, and he probably was in some way. We all sort of choose our path in other ways, but he did feel like, maybe rightfully so, he was a victim of circumstance, and he didn't have a choice but to go down this life path. And he did not want my sister to feel like that was her option, her only option. So he was really strict with her.
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like my dad never let me stay out late, but my brother, who was 2 years younger than me, could come home whenever he wanted. And he turned out to be pretty reckless. He did not have any boundaries, and it was not great for him. But then again, I know some people that have boundaries that, go quite reckless themselves. So I don't know, again, if there's any perfect recipe for parenting. If anyone knows of one, please send it my way.
Totally.
I'm just kind of fumbling through parenthood a day at a time. My kids are tiny and gorgeous, and I just want them to stay tiny and gorgeous forever. So your sister was in the house on the day that your father was murdered. I just wondered, this is all in the Ice Cold Case podcast. I haven't gone too much into the details of like your journey of investigating, because I think that first of all, we'd love listeners to go over and listen. And second of all, it's better to hear it from you in the form that you intended it to be heard in than for me to just say like, what happened. But I think to give the listeners some information on, what happened that day and how you started putting your investigation together years later.
Yeah. So according to police, there was my And my dad's sister lived next door to him and had a son, Omar, who was like 20, 21 at the time. And according to police, there was a home invasion next door to my dad's house. And my dad's sister, Pearl, her son, Omar, and Omar's girlfriend, Kim, were inside of the house. And roughly an estimated 4 people broke into the house, tied them up with phone cords, poured rubbing alcohol on them, and they were looking for money. The story goes, they were in the house for like 40 minutes. They didn't find any money. Omar went outside with them. They ended up at my dad's house. My dad heard something outside. I've kind of assumed that my dad heard a familiar voice, which would have been Omar's voice, and was walking to the front door to see what was going on. At this point, it's like 6:40 in the morning. It's summer, so it's bright outside. Like the sun is up. It is not dark. I think when people envision the day, they think of it being dark outside. It's morning. And my dad's heading to the front door, no gun in hand. The door is kicked in while he's, several feet away from it. And it's one shot to the head. My sister's asleep. She hears it. She hears our dad hit the floor. She waits like a minute and then goes out into the living room and finds our dad. These men are gone. Omar is gone. Everyone is gone. And that was it. And so things are very weird, even just from this jumping off point. But that's all I had to go off of. And that's all I had to, I don't know who these men are. I don't even know exactly how many there were. The timings are all a little weird. The only timing we have to work backwards from are these 911 calls, which we have record of. And then everything else is sort of an estimated. Like, okay, if they were there for about 40 minutes, that means that they got there around 6. But if they were there for 45, that means they got there at 5:55. I don't know. And 5 minutes makes a big difference in these types of situations. So I really only have this to go off of. And that was sort of the jumping off point for my investigation.
That's so frustrating to try and piece things together, and you're not sure if you have any correct information other than the way he died. It's strange that, one house next door is ransacked and those same people, assuming, might not even be. Same people show up at your father's house, but they don't ransack his house, and your sister's sleeping and she has no idea. That's so bizarre. It doesn't work in my brain, when you're trying to fit pieces of a puzzle together. Some things don't, even just with that, they don't fit. So what do you do next when you get the police reports, you get these 911 calls, which are so impactful? I was not expecting those when I was listening to the podcast episode. I don't even know the process for being given that type of information, but it made such a huge difference. It kind of really put you there that night, and it's terrifying.
Yeah. And then I just started asking around. I was calling people. I was trying to get a hold of people, reaching out to anyone I could, family members, just to try to get a grasp on like what was going on, especially in this town. Who were the key players at the time in the drug scene? Who did my dad hang out with? Who did he associate with? Who did he know? Who did he have enemies with? All the sort of standard questions that you see like in a television show or a movie. I was just asking because I had no other, I've never done this before. So that was all I had to go off of. And so, yeah, that was where I started. And yeah.
Do you feel like going down this road and following these different leads that you've met any resistance in places that you feel shouldn't be resisting your kind of inquiries?
Yeah, I've been met with almost exclusively resistance, it feels like. There have been some people, like my sister is really willing to talk, and other people have been like kind of helpful. But like mostly, family members have been pretty resistant. The police have been like basically not helpful at all. It's been really difficult, actually. And I didn't think, I guess I just assumed, well, I'm doing their job for them. So they're going to be like grateful that I'm jumping in. Surely they want another case solved in their town. It like looks good for them because like the history books will never show that it was me. On paper, it'll be like Belmont County solves this case. So like they're not going to be mad that I'm basically doing work for free for them. And that is not the case. They were not happy with
They're
any.
like, we don't want to do our jobs and we don't want you to do our jobs.
Yeah, it feels very much like, no, we were actively avoiding this. So you are now doing us a disservice by jumping in.
And when you talk about finding out the key players of the time, how has that been going down those kind of leads and lines of inquiry? Because you're putting yourself in potentially some pretty risky situations by going out and looking for certain people.
I've been kind of fortunate where like some of them have come to me. So one of the main suspects in the case hit me up on Facebook and wanted to talk. And so that was like sick. Okay, great. This is easy. And I was like,
Yeah.
this isn't so hard. Like they're just like showing up in my messages. But some have been more difficult. I'm looking for a couple people right now that have been a little bit harder to pin down. Some I've found and just aren't willing to talk, and that's sort of the name of the game. But some I'm like actively looking for, and I cannot find them anywhere. It's like these people have fully fallen off the face of the earth. So,
Gosh.
yeah, I'm looking. I have a couple countries still left to search, but
My gosh. What
yeah,
about when is it like, I imagine it's like, when people decide to put their ancestry kind of genealogy tree together, is it like you have a name and you find a person with that name and you have to work out if it's that same person, and then you finally like you get some type of information to confirm that is who you're looking for? That's got to be so satisfying to be like, I found them, I finally found them.
I haven't had that moment yet, but I hope
Oh my
that it
gosh.
feels
I
like that.
I imagine like that's what it's like being a private detective or a private
Totally.
investigator.
And I have no idea what these people look like. I mean, I have a name and like that's it. So yeah, it's very interesting.
I really hope that you get to have so many of those moments. And I mean, it's like a cliffhanger at the end of season 1, because we're like, we've got the answers, and then it's like, actually, plot twist, we don't have the answers because the person we thought it was has reached out and now we think it's probably not them. So, there's so many different reasons for people to listen to the podcast. Ice Cold Case is phenomenally produced. It's so crisp, it's so clean, it's so well done. There's like music and sound effects, and there's like ambience and tones, and it's like suspenseful and dark, but done in a really sensitive way. And it was quite refreshing to listen to. So even though it's difficult subject material, I was very impressed by the level of production and just the way that the story was put together. I want to know how you managed to do that.
That's crazy. I feel like it's not what I wanted it to be, which is funny. I think it sounds fine. I had higher expectations for myself, and it's okay. But thank you it was very nice. We do put in a lot of work and effort into the sound of the show, and we go through several drafts of scripts, and I'll never forget, I think it was episode 2 or 3. We probably rewrote like 9 times. We wrote it, we recorded the whole thing. We went back and listened to the first draft from the editor. And I was like, oh, we can't put this out. Like, this isn't it. And we rewrote it, and we rewrote it again, and we rewrote it again. And every step of the way, I do hit a point where it's not exactly what I want it to be, but I'm like, this is as good as it can be for what the resources that we have. But I am very particular with the writing. I'm very sensitive to the music choice and where sound effects go. And, we add them into the script and we get it back and we hear it and we're like, oh, take that out, or, oh, we need to add this. That it goes through just so many different drafts and rounds of edits because I'm so particular. I probably drive everybody crazy, but
yeah, but it's your story, it's your father, so you want to make sure that it sounds the way that you want it to. I think it sounds great, and I wouldn't have. It's so funny when you think a certain way about something and you speak to the person that made it, and then you're like, oh, like when an artist is just like, they hate the way that their painting came out because all they've done for the last like 5 years is look at that painting, like, this is the best thing I've ever seen. I hate it. It's horrible.
I know, it is funny. I have a lot of friends who are comedians, and I was just talking to a friend last night. He's the funniest person I know. She was sitting in the back last night, with tears in her eyes, and she's like, I just wish I was funny. And I'm like, oh my God, you're hilarious. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. You're like, you're joking right now, aren't you?
Right.
This is
I'm
a,
like,
this is,
this is a bit. It has to be. You're so funny. And I feel like I just did that to you. So, yeah, it is. I think one of the things I get frustrated by, I read every review. I shouldn't do that, but the reviews have started to go down because it's not solved and people feel like I'm talking in circles and I don't know, who did it and I'm, whatever, whatever. And I think that, I guess if you are listening to this and you plan on listening to the show, it's a different type of podcast. It's not, there isn't a beginning, middle, and end because I'm just doing this in real time. And, sometimes it does feel like I'm talking in circles because I'm just confused and I don't know
and
what's
you
going
are
on.
being sent round in circles as well.
Yeah. And
You're
that's,
being like, go talk to this person. You're like, I've talked to that person. They're like, maybe talk to them again. And you're like, okay,
yeah.
back in this person's house.
Yeah. And I don't know. And I think it's one person, then I think it's someone else. And then I'm back on this person. And it doesn't feel like I'm making any progress. But that's the reality of what I'm doing. And
Yeah.
so I'm just sharing that with people as it's happening to me. And so part 2 is a little bit more like maybe a little bit of me talking in circles. The beginning is really strong because I obviously talk with Daryl Smith, but then it gets a little bit like now I'm even more confused than I was in the beginning.
Right.
Part 3 is about to come out and it's a little bit more concise and it's a little bit more sharp. But yeah, I think if you can get through part 2 without writing me a bad review, I think you'll be rewarded when part 3 drops because there's just a lot more information that I wasn't able to share at the time because I didn't have it or it wasn't ready. But yeah, it's been interesting because yeah, I would love to have put out a much more polished show when I had already solved it and then I could go back and kind of tell the story. But that's just not, the reality of what I'm doing and the type of show that I'm creating.
I think it's really special the way that the audience go on the journey with you, kind of almost as you're doing it. So when I started my podcast, I didn't know anything about cults. And if, some people that have listened from the start, I don't know how you've done it. Like we're like 400 episodes in. So we're like, whoever's listened whilst I've made these episodes, we've all learned the same, because they've listened to me interview and learn as I've learned it for the first time.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite cool. I think that's like pretty different, people get to listen to your podcast and hear you investigating almost like as you're doing it, like hearing things for the first time and hearing your reaction and then hearing people remember things that they didn't remember until they started talking with you. It's different, but I understand. I watch Unsolved Mysteries and I'm still frustrated when it's unsolved at the end, even though that's the name of the show. But it's not, we can't always have things in neat, tidy, resolved packages. And that's the kind of instant gratification world that we live in, It's like when you watch, videos where somebody's doing like patio cleaning or sofa or carpet cleaning, and you get to see the really disgusting, grubby carpet. And then 30 seconds later, you get the really satisfying, like, really clean and that's the kind of doom scrolling world that we live in. We see the horrible stuff, and then 30 seconds later, we're seeing like, wow, look at this amazing result. And again, reality-wise, that's just it's just not the way that the world works most of the time. 250,000 plus unsolved cases most of the time. So I really just wanted to end on asking you how you protect yourself when you're talking about this same thing every single day, whether it's planning a new season, whether it's sitting down to record or write a script, or whether it's coming on to other people's shows or going to CrimeCon and talking about the fact that your father was murdered. And like, how do you talk about that without re-traumatizing yourself or traumatizing yourself to begin with? What advice do you have for other people who are survivors of trauma, who are trying to talk about their situations without harming themselves?
Yeah, I am like, and maybe not the best person to answer this question, but that's why I'm like, I can't help but laugh when people ask me this all the time because I'm like, I don't know. I think partially just like listening to like your body and your mind and what you need. It's okay to say no. It's okay to, not do something or not have a day where you're talking about it. For me personally, I love Bravo television. I watch Real Housewives like every day of the week. I listen to Watch What Crappens, the podcast where Ben Mandelker and Robbie Karam recap all the Bravo shows. I love Bravo. I love Andy Cohen. If I were to join a cult, it would be a Bravo cult. I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. And it helps me sort of disassociate from the world, and it's just the best. And so that's kind of my way personally of escaping and getting my mind off of things and like feeling like a reset. And again, I'm like the worst person to ask because I've got friends who are like, I meditate, I read a book. I'm like, I watch adult women scream at each other on a couch about the other woman saying that they smell like hospital, whatever that means. And like, but that's what I do. And I'm not going to judge anyone for what they do because mine is crazy. But I love it and it helps. I made a bunch of friendship bracelets last year for CrimeCon and I'm thinking about doing it again this year. And I did that while watching Real Housewives of Salt Lake City. I watched all 4 seasons, all in like one sort of week and a half stint making these friendship bracelets. And I love it. It's my way to disassociate and escape from the world. So
it's like stepping into a different reality, but only for a brief time. Don't step into a new reality altogether if that means actually joining a Bravo cult, because we do not endorse joining cults of any kind. You need to be careful with those types of interests. I'm sure that there's like, what is this? Vanderpump Rules? I'm sure there's like a cult following for that show as well.
Totally.
I haven't watched it.
Totally. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I love Vanderpump.
I haven't seen it. I think I'm going to have to just
highly recommend.
I feel like, as somebody that grew up in a high control environment, there's probably, I'm just making assumptions here, so correct me if I'm wrong. There's probably been times where somebody has made a pop culture reference and it's gone over your head almost, and you've been like, I don't know who that person is, or I don't know what film that's from. And for me, I'm like, I just need to watch like new shows. And my 5-year-old son came home from school the other day and started saying like the word Riz, and I was like, gosh, to Google things. I think I just need to keep up with the kids, so I'll probably have to watch Vanderpump at some point. But CrimeCon, yes, are you going to be at CrimeCon UK this year?
I will be at CrimeCon UK this year. I'm very excited and it's going to be really fun. My friends from Affirmative Murder from the US are also coming this year. So it's going to be really great. I love CrimeCon UK and I love Nancy and I love the whole team. So I'm really excited.
It's so good. I love it. It's always the best weekend of the year. And if you use the code CULT, CULT, you can get 10% off your tickets today. And the link is always in the episode description, as listeners probably know. And if you're a patron, you can get 25% off your tickets, which is
that's great.
Pretty cool discount. I think it's 25, 15 or 25. Big difference there, but reach out if you're interested and I will find out the specifics for you. I'm really looking forward to CrimeCon. It's in June on the 7th and 8th in London. I hope that I can steal a friendship bracelet from you because that's 100%. Really cool.
100%.
I give all my lanyards on the side then.
I love that.
And I go and get a badge off of all of the people's tables. And then each year I come back with a... But last year no one had badges and I was really sad.
I'll make some. I'm going to write that down. I'm going to make some.
With like a badge of every person that's been at the event. It's really cool.
I love it.
So I'm going to be going around collecting badges from people and friendship bracelets this time, which is going to be awesome.
Yeah, I love it.
So Ice Cold Case Podcast and Snitch Ass Daddy available on music platforms, media players. Is there a video for it yet?
There's not. It was discussed and then like life got away from me, but maybe this year is the year I do a video. Or
video
another song. I don't know.
or another, yeah, I mean, just an album dropping 2000 and maybe 26 with music videos on the way. And if there is an update, I will let the listeners know. I'll put links to the podcast and the song in the episode description. And calls to action before we go. What kind of things do you ask for in terms of information? I don't have a large listener base, and I don't know if any of the listeners are. Actually, I think there might be a few from the West Virginia area, but specifically like Belmont, I don't know. So, what do you say to people when you're saying, like, if you know anything, come forward?
Yeah. So if you are from the area, know anyone who's in the area, obviously, you can reach out to me. There is an email. It's icecoldcasepodcast@gmail.com for like any information. If you're not, the easiest way to sort of spread it to people who might is to continue to like share the show. The more popular it becomes, the more likely someone from this town is hearing like, oh, there's this popular podcast about a case from here, and then someone goes, oh wait, I know about that. So sharing it, writing a review, all of those like weird things that are free and seem like they don't really make a difference, they kind of do. And I'm hearing from people who haven't even listened to the podcast, they've just heard of the podcast from other people talking about it. So, and that's been really helpful because those are people who like actually know things, but they're like, it from a generation where they're not listening to podcasts, but someone that they know is like, oh, there's this really popular podcast from your town. And then they're like, oh, wait, what's it about? And then all of a sudden I'm getting an email from someone. So yeah, if you don't think that you can be helpful with like actual information, just sharing it is super helpful. I know a lot of people, especially in true crime, that are fans of the genre are in group chats with friends or Facebook groups about cases or anything like that. So just sharing it with people who are also similarly interested can really sort of help it get to where it needs to go to get more information. So yeah, that's kind of it.
Your website as well. I mean, you're going to be you're doing a tour by the looks of things, appearing in all sorts of places all over America. And
Yes.
then there's London down here as well, which is just really cool.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I'll put a link to the website as well into the episode description, because if anybody needs to get in touch, they can do it. I mean, and you're Madison_McGhee on all your social
Everything.
medias as well.
Yeah.
So we will make sure that if anybody has anything to let you know, that they have a way to tell you. And thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for getting out of your cozy warm bed, and thank you for coming to talk about something that you talk about all day, every day, and for having a conversation about something that's still linked to cults, but not completely, because everything in the world seems to be linked to cults in one way or another.
Totally.
At least in my world. Sometimes I'm like, I'm going to talk today about this. And they are like, so before that, there was a cult. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. So there's still cults. And I just appreciate you and your time and the work that you're doing. I really, really hope that you get some answers and some concrete information and get to have that huzzah moment of, tracking somebody down and finding them. And I'm really looking forward to meeting you in person.
Yes. Yeah. I can't wait. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing this with your listeners.
Thank you, Madison. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
You too. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.